it's not going to be popular in Washington, and I know, in fact, that it's not popular in Washington. And of course, U.S. arms exports to Israel are the exports that really matter. The UK arms exports to Israel are very small by comparison. But where it does matter is that now the UK, America's closest ally and also a very significant country in military terms, has decided to suspend these licenses, and that will raise questions in Washington, in Congress, and elsewhere about whether the US should do the same. My name is Elisabeth Braw, and I'm a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security.
Okay, Elizabeth, look, a lot has been made, hasn't it, of this decision by the UK government. And a lot has been made, really, of the sort of negligible impact that it might have on Israel's arms capability. I wonder if the real impact will occur sort of more in terms of relationships. I'm wondering if you can tell me kind of who are the players that this could most impact?
Yeah, there are two sides really to this decision. There is the sort of the technical side. The government received advice on potential breaches that could result from these weapons being used in Israel, and decided that on that basis it would suspend export licenses of these particular weapons. And then there is the political side of it, which is really a signal to Israel and indeed to other countries around the world that the UK will apply the law without fear or favour. And I think that matters, because otherwise the UK and other Western countries would be vulnerable to accusations that they apply the law as it's written to some countries and not exporting weapons to them, whereas it doesn't apply them to other countries because they're closer allies. And I think that is an accusation that has been, in fact, made a number of times since the war in Gaza began. And so the UK is trying to do these two things at the same time, applying the law and signaling to everybody listening and watching that there will be no preference for any country over another country.
Obviously, the reaction out of Israel has been there's been a lot of disappointment and sadness, I think has been the words used. Benjamin Netanyahu has explicitly said this emboldens Hamas in the Middle East. Does it?
I don't think Hamas needs the UK government to be emboldened. Hamas makes very clearly very clever plans on its own, and regardless of what any Western government says or does. So I don't think that is an accurate assessment. But we should remember, this is not just about Israel. This is about the global role and responsibility that Western governments have. They make a lot of weapons, or that countries make a lot of weapons, and our Western governments have a responsibility to make sure these weapons are used responsibly. Some people would say no weapon use is ever responsible, but nevertheless, there are rules regarding how you can use weapons, and the UK has such rules. And so the UK really has a responsibility to the rest of the world to say, we have some fabulous weapons that are made in our country, but we will only allow them to be used under certain conditions. And I think that will ultimately, in the longer run, benefit the UK, because this is not just about Israel. This is about other countries that may have in mind to use weapons beyond what the UK government would condone, and then they will see that's not going to be possible. The licenses will be suspended.
I noticed quotes from the chief rabbi in the UK as well, who sort of made the point that, these are shared enemies that, you say perhaps not emboldened, but, I'm sure they'll have taken some sort of message from it. So shared enemies of Israel, of the UK, I guess by extension of the US and the West in general. I'm just wondering how exactly that sort of enemyship, if that is such a word, manifests itself in the West, because we tend to talk about Hamas as a body that affects the Middle East. We don't tend to hear about work that they might be doing if you want to call it work, in the wider Western world?
Yes, and indeed, Hamas is a body that or organization that operates in the Middle East. We have other organizations that operate in our countries and pose significant pose. We have other organizations that operate in our countries and that pose significant threats to our countries. So I don't think it's fair to call Hamas a shared enemy of the Western Israel. It is a shared enemy to the extent that that Hamas threatens Israel, and Israel is a close ally of the West. But the debate really is about how UK-made weapons are used by Israel in this conflict. It's not about Hamas. This particular decision is really about the UK and Israel. And there are other debates and sanctions and actions we can have regarding Hamas and what actions to take vis-a-vis Hamas. But export licenses to Israel, that is a separate issue.
I just want to read you what the UK Defence Secretary John Healey said to us today. He talked about the call he had made to his Israeli counterpart Yoav Gallant, who he said found the call unwelcome, but he insisted sometimes your closest friends are the ones that need to tell the hardest truths, adding the government had a legal duty to review the arms exports. But it seems to me, Elisabeth, that it seems unproven. Well, it is unproven, isn't it? It's suggesting it's possible it might happen. And if I can sort of make a comparison to Hollywood, I guess, it feels to me a bit like this is the film Minority Report, where they kind of arrest people before they commit a crime. I'm just wondering how you think the UK government has been able to make a final decision on these arms licenses, given that they're not saying a crime has been committed in terms of international law.
Yes, we haven't seen the legal advice that the government received, so we don't know what's in it. But clearly, something in it gave strong enough indications that there was a risk of these weapons being used. Civil servants wouldn't say, "Well, I think in my head that these weapons may be used." These are serious officials who don't play games with the advice they offer or provide to ministers. But you are right. I mean, it's not the basis of their use that has prompted the UK to suspend these licenses. It's the potential of them being used. But again, it's the line that the UK takes with other countries as well. And again, this is where this comes back to global signaling. The UK is essentially telling Israel and the rest of the world that if it is concerned about its weapons or weapons made in the UK being used in an inappropriate way, it will not hesitate to take actions. And that is clearly today is on this day it's a signal to Israel, but it's also a signal to any country that may have such plans. And it's also a signal that the UK doesn't play favorites among friends and the countries that are less friendly with the UK. The same standards apply to everybody.
And of course, the other area of disappointment within Israel is sort of around the timing of this. And again, I've got another quote for you. This is from Fleur Hassan Nahum, the special envoy to Israeli government, who told us this morning, "I find it absurd that in the middle of a war, the government would write reports on how these things are being used. They should be done afterwards. When the UK and US were fighting ISIS in the Middle East, they were not asked for reports on how things were being used. In fact," she said, "many in the British military have told me they think Israel's going far above and beyond what the Brits did when it came to ISIS to ensure that they were within the confines of international law." Is the timing of this, could it have been better, or actually is it the duty to do this during the war, because of course there's a future of the war to come, and if people are dying because of these actions, or potentially going to die because of the actions of Israel utilizing weaponry built in the UK, then that needs to be stopped.
It needs to be stopped or not happen in the first place. And on top of that, we have rules here in the UK that the government, once it decides to investigate whether a decision has to be made and the evidence is presented, it can't just sit on the evidence until there's a convenient time that suits its allies. Sure, that may have happened over the years, but then the government has rightly been held to account. And on this in this case, if the government was given advice, as it has indeed has indeed been the case, and then sat on that advice until there was a convenient time to make the decision, or indeed announce the decision, then that would cause considerable and justified criticism. And then we also, of course, have the reality that the government is held to account by Parliament, and so today happens to be the first day that Parliament is back in session. And if the government had sat on it until a convenient time, you can imagine the sentiment among MPs, who would then rightly say, well, hang on, why are we not receiving the information and indeed hearing from the responsible minister what he is going to do?
How do you think the decision by the UK government will have been received in Washington?
It's not going to be popular in Washington, and I know, in fact, that it's not popular in Washington. And of course, US arms exports to Israel are the exports that really matter. The UK arms exports to Israel are very small by comparison. But where it does matter is that now the UK, America's closest ally and also a very significant country in military terms, has decided to suspend these licenses, and that will raise questions in Washington, in Congress, and elsewhere about whether the US should do the same. Those questions have been raised sort of on the margins before, but never really gained any traction. Now the UK, a very significant ally, a very significant economy, and a very significant country geopolitically speaking, has made that decision, and that will energize the debate about whether the US should do the same. And it's going to be a very uncomfortable situation for President Biden, for Vice President Harris, for Congress, and because you can't have it both ways. You either say that there is a cause or a reason to suspend arms export licenses, or there is no reason. You can't sort of muddle your way through, and that's a choice that now will be more urgent. We will be presented to President Biden and others in more urgent terms.
I'll explain my thinking here, but I might be extrapolating way too far. Obviously, until now, Kamala Harris has said, there will be no change in our support for Israel and in providing the arms that the US does should she win the election. And it's one thing to make that claim, when there is a status quo on that with all of your main allies. But given now opponents or critics of Kamala Harris can say, well, actually, one of our, closest allies, one of our closest friends who we are, in theory, at least most aligned with in terms of the way we think, have actually changed the way they want to do things. Could this actually affect the US election in terms of her policy on this? And if she sticks to it, critics might just think, I'm not sure that she's right on this, and now there's precedent as well for going in the other direction.
Well, this will be a litmus test really to see how much Americans follow UK news. Let's see over the next few days how much attention this gets, and whether the attention is of a kind where she feels she has to take a position and then explain it. But if she does, there is very little for her to be gained, because simply she has succeeded so well so far in the presidential race by essentially not being very, very clear on any political issues, except a few where she knows it can bring up support, abortion and such issues. But this would be an issue where, if she were to take a position, or if she were to be forced to take a position, it would only harm her campaign. And that's why I think probably US politicians, including the Harris campaign, are hoping that this news won't make it big time in the US. But we should also remember that in the US, the debate is changing, regardless of what the UK does. We have seen young people in particular expressed very strong sentiments about the situation in Gaza, and that has led to some awkward moments and indeed periods for members of Congress and indeed for Joe Biden, because until now, Israel support for Israel has been pretty much unequivocal, very strong. And then if you have this growing base, especially among young people who feel that unequivocal support should be moderated, then that is a very difficult position for policymakers to be in.